Hello, folks. Welcome back to the AA Big Book Stories. I'm your host, Jason. Today's video was brought to you by James 414 Vape Sales. That's James 414 Vape Sales. They're out of Mount Vernon, Kentucky. They have a Facebook page. They're not very far from actually downtown Mount Vernon. And they have they're on Google, and they also have a Facebook page. So if you guys are through there and want to look them up, they're on the way to Somerset. For all those people traveling from Mount Vernon to Somerset. With that being said, let's just jump into it. Today, finally, we're at the end, the last story on part 2, story number 17 of part 2 of the Big Book Stories in the back of the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. Window of Opportunity. This young alcoholic stepped out of a second-story window into AA. I got sober while I was still in college. Once outside of a meeting, I overheard a conversation between a sober student and a woman who had lived in the town where I went to school. She was explaining why why so many local residents dislike students. She described the common perception of students as arrogant, self-centered, and went on to tell the following story. I am a nurse and I work in the emergency room. 2 years ago, a student was brought in by an ambulance in the middle of the night. He had gotten drunk and walked through a second-story window and had fallen 25 feet head first into a concrete window well. He was brought in covered with blood. His head had swollen the size of a watermelon. He kept swearing at the nurses and doctors, telling them to keep their hands off him and threatening to sue them. He was, without a doubt, the single most obnoxious person I've ever met. At that point, I interrupted her. "That was me," I said. "That was my last drunk. I had walked through the window when I was 19 years old. How had I gotten there? I had always been a good kid growing up, the kind of son other mothers loved. I was at the top of my classes academically and been in almost no trouble for the first 17 years of my life. I would like to say that was because of my well-developed moral fiber. In fact, much of it was a result of fear. My earliest memories include threats by my parents to throw me out onto the streets for the slightest acts of disobedience. The thought of being forced to live on the streets is pretty terrifying for a 16-year-old. Those threats, coupled with a fair amount of physical punishment, kept me frightened and obedient. As I grew ever older, however, I made a plan. I would be dutiful until I graduated from high school. Then I would escape to college, secure my economic future, and never go home again. Just after my 18th birthday, I left for college. I thought, finally free. I was in for a rude awakening. Like many alcoholics, I had spent much of my life feeling different, as though I just didn't quite fit in. I covered those feelings and my low self-esteem by being one of the smartest people in any group, if not the smartest. Additionally, I became a performer in crowds, always ready with a quick joke to point out the humor in any situation. I managed to bring a great deal of laughter into my life. I went to a college filled with people who had also spent their entire lives at or near the top of their academic classes. Suddenly, I was no longer special. To make matters worse, many of them had what I had only dreamed of, money. My family was strictly working class, struggling to get by on what my father earned. Money had always been a big issue, and I equated it with security, prestige, and worth. My father was fond of saying that the sole purpose of life is to make money. I had classmates whose names were household words that connoted wealth. I was ashamed of my family and ashamed of myself. My shaky confidence crumbled. I was terrified of being found out. I knew that if others discovered who I really was, they wouldn't like me and I would be left alone, worthless and alone. I discovered alcohol and I tried it. Then I discovered alcohol. I had tried it a few times in high school, but never enough to get drunk. I knew getting drunk meant out of control. My escape plan required that I always keep my wits about me. I was too afraid to be out of control. When I got to college, however, that fear left me. Excuse me. In order to fit in, I pretended at first that I had had an extensive drinking history, as many of my classmates. It was not long before my history surpassed everyone's. My drinking career was short and destructive, and my alcoholic progression was very fast. I got drunk for the first time in October. By November, people were willing to wager money that I could not go 1 week without a drink. I won, and in a celebration, drank myself sick. By January, I was a daily drunk, and by April, a daily drug user as well. I didn't last too long. As I look back on that period, I realize how true it is that one of the primary differences between alcoholics and non-alcoholics is that non-alcoholics change their behavior to meet their goals, and alcoholics change their goals to meet their behaviors. Everything that had been important to me, all of my dreams, goals, aspirations, were swept away in a wave of booze. I realized quickly that I could not drink and function at any high level. That did not matter. I was willing to give up anything so that I could keep drinking. I went from being a solid student to nearly flunking out of college, from being anointed a class leader to being shunned as a pariah. I almost never went to class and did little of the required reading. I never attended any of the many cultural events sponsored by the college. I forsook everything that makes college worthwhile in favor of drinking occasionally. Some sliver of pride would work its way back through the chaos, resentment, and fear, and cause me to look at my life. But that shame was too great, and I would drive it back down with bottles of vodka and cases of beer. Because my college was very small and did not take long for me to come to the attention of the college deans, it was under their watchful eyes that I agreed to go to enter counseling. While the administration saw this as an opportunity to help a troubled student, I saw it as a bargaining. I would go to counseling to make them happy, and they would owe me one. Not surprisingly, the counseling had no effect. My daily drinking continued unabated. About a year later, I realized that I was in trouble and had failed a class during the winter term. I had rarely attended and not turned in the term paper, which was 50% of our grade was based on. The spring term was looking equally bleak. I enrolled in a class that I had attended only once, and I had not written any of the required papers or bothered to show up for midterm examination. I was bound for failure and expulsion. My life had become unmanageable, and I knew it. I went back to the dean who had guided me into counseling, and for the first time admitted to myself and to someone else that I had had a problem with alcohol. I didn't think I was an alcoholic. I wasn't even sure what that was, but I knew my life was out of control. The dean allowed me to withdraw from the classes that day, the day before the final exam, on one condition: that I entered a treatment center. I agreed. A few days went by, the pressure lifted, and my life did not look so unmanageable. In fact, it looked like as if I was back in the saddle. So I thanked the dean for his help, but told him I would be okay on my own. I did not go to a rehab. 2 weeks later, I walked through a second-story window. After insulting the emergency room personnel, I slipped into unconsciousness, where I remained for 5 days. I awoke in a neck brace with complete double vision. My parents were furious. I was flown home, and the future looked bleak. God's timing, however, is impeccable. My college had a long history of drinkers, including Dr. Bob. At the time of my accident, the deans were assessing how to respond to student alcohol abuse and were waiting to try their latest idea, Alcoholics Anonymous. I was their test case. They told me on no uncertain terms that I would never get back into college unless I went to AA. Under that pressure, I went to my first meeting. Looking back, that may have been the first healthy decision I had ever made with respect to alcohol. With one definition of a bottom is the point when the last thing you lost or the next thing you're about to lose is more important to you than booze. That point is different for everyone, and some of us have to die before we get there. For me, though, it was clear I was willing to do anything to get back into school. I went to my first AA meeting with absolutely no idea what AA was about. I am from a large Irish Catholic family and have had several relatives in and out of the program. AA, like a prison, was shameful, however, and was never discussed. I also had no idea what alcoholism was. I remember a girlfriend once told me that her mother had a drinking problem, but that she was not alcoholic. Curious, I asked what the difference was. An alcoholic, she told me, is someone who needs to drink every day, even if it's only one drink. A person with a drinking problem does not have to drink every day, but once she starts, she cannot stop. By definition, I was an alcoholic with a drinking problem. I was surprised by my first meeting. It was in a church, and whatever I had expected, it was not this room filled with well-dressed, smiling, happy people. No rancid coats or three-day beards, no bloodshot eyes, wheezing coughs, and shaky hands, but laughter. Someone was talking about God. I was sure I was in the wrong place. Then a woman introduced herself and that she was an alcoholic. I knew then I was in AA. She spoke about feelings of insecurity replaced by confidence, fear replaced by faith, resentment replaced by love, and despair replaced by joy. I knew those feelings. I had I had insecurity, fear, resentment, and despair. I could not believe it. How was a person who was happy? It seemed like a long time since I had been one of those. After the meeting, people welcomed me with open arms and gave me their telephone numbers. The discussion meeting was followed by a speaker meeting where I had my first awakening in AA. The speaker said, "If you're an apple, you can be the best apple you can be, but you can never be an orange." I was an apple, all right. And for the first time I understood that I had spent my life trying to be an orange. I looked around the room filled with apples, and if I was understanding the speaker, most of them were no longer trying to be oranges. My progress in AA, however, was slow. I refused to go to meetings outside my neighborhood, which meant that I only went on Tuesday and Thursday nights. I always felt better after a meeting. I remember at times when something upsetting would happen on a Friday, and I would tell myself, I wish it were Tuesday so I could go to a meeting. No matter how many suggestions I heard, how many rides were offered, however, I simply would not go to meetings on those other nights. People gave me many other good suggestions as well. They suggested that I stay out of a relationship. I was young and single, and I rejected this idea out of hand. For the first year, I bounced from one sick relationship to another. They suggested that I get a sponsor. I had no idea what a sponsor was, too proud to ask, but I was sure I didn't need one. After all, I was smarter than the rest of these people. They might need someone to tell them how to run their lives, but double vision, neck brace, and all, I was doing just fine on my own. People suggested that I find a higher power. I was not fooled. I knew what they said higher power, they meant God. And I knew that God waited for me to step out of line just once so he could take his revenge. I wanted no part of God. With this resistance, I plodded along for a few months, however. Whenever people asked me how I was doing, I would say fine, just fine, no matter how hard I was crying on the inside. Then I reached a crossroads. I was sober. I was sober about 6 months, and I was not getting any better. I contemplated suicide almost every day. My emotions swung between paralyzing despair and murderous rage, often in the space of a single moment. I was not happy, joyous, and free. I was miserable, and I was sick of it. I decided that I had had enough, I went to the Tuesday night meeting, fully intent on sharing honestly. I arrived at the meeting and no one else was there. This meeting, which was routinely numbered 20 people, was empty. I waited for a few minutes and was preparing to leave when a man who I barely knew walked through the door. He suggested that he and I have a meeting, and I was sure it was a bad idea. He asked me how I was doing. That was all I needed. The pain, fear, misery, anger, loss, resentment, and despair came pouring out. For the next 45 minutes I talked at this man, who continued to nod his head, smile, and say, "Yeah, I remember feeling that way." For the first time I made completely honest contact with another human being. I showed someone who I really was without fear of rejection. I took action I took an action that was designed to make me feel better rather than to just look better. I was met with acceptance and love. When I had finished talking, he told me something simple. "You don't have to drink over it." What an idea. I had thought that situations made me drink. If I was angry, I drank. If I was happy, I drank. Bored or excited, exalted or depressed, I drank. Here was a man telling me that independent of my life situation, I did not have to drink. If I stuck with AA, I could stay sober under any and all conditions. He gave me hope, and in many ways he symbolized the door through which I finally walked into Alcoholics Anonymous. I began to change. I began to pray. I became actively involved in working the steps. I previously dismissed them as tools of mental inferiors. Now I embrace them as the rungs of a ladder to salvation. I began working with a sponsor and became active in my home group. I did not understand how making coffee or cleaning up after meetings could have anything to do with staying sober, but older members told me that service work would keep me sober, so I tried it. It worked. My life began to change just before my first anniversary. I was readmitted into college. I arrived back on campus terrified. All I known there was drinking. How was I ever going to stay sober under these conditions? The answer was simple. I threw myself into AA. Some very loving people took me under their wings. I had the opportunity to form a fair amount of 12-step work with other students, and by the time I graduated, there was a thriving AA community at the school. After graduating, I attended law school. I arrived to find an AA that was very different from which I had grown accustomed to. I was sure I would get drunk because those people weren't doing it right. My sponsor back at college, aware of my pro- propensity for finding fault, assured me that if my new friends were not doing it right, it was my obligation to show them how. So I did, driven by fear and conceit. I I set out to remake AA in my image. I am certain that if membership had depended on being liked, I would have been expelled. After some time, I called my sponsor to report my progress. He stopped me with a short, simple question. "These people aren't doing it right. Are they staying sober?" I admitted that, despite their failings, they were staying sober. "Good," he said. "You have told them what AA is. Now it is time for you to listen and to figure out how they are staying sober." I followed that suggestion and began to listen. Slowly but surely, some wisdom and humility began to creep in. I became more teachable. I found God working all around me with where I was sure I had been alone. When I opened my eyes enough to see the miracle, I found that it was right in front of my face. I was growing in God's love. I was fortunate to have an opportunity to spend time abroad during law school. That was something I had dreamed about while drinking, but when push came to shove, I drank. Now sober, I have been in meetings in probably a dozen countries and have always been amazed by the message that transcends all linguistics and cultural differences. There is a solution. Together we live soberly, joyously and freely. My life has been one great joy. I am now 33 years old, and God willing, in 1 month I will celebrate my 14th sober AA anniversary. I am surrounded by loving friends on whom I depend on and who depend on me. I am reconciled with my parents for who I have been estranged. My life has been filled with laughter again, something alcohol had always taken away. I was married shortly after my 9th anniversary to a loving woman, and 1 week before my 12th anniversary, our son was born. Through him I learned more about unconditional love, the value of wonder, and sheer joy of being alive. I have a wonderful job that most days I appreciate. I am active in AA service work and have both a sponsor and several sponsees with whom I am privileged to work. All of these are gifts from God, and I express my gratitude by enjoying them. I once knew a woman who was crying before a meeting. She was approached by a 5-year-old girl who told her, "You don't have to cry here. This is a good place. They took my daddy and made him better." And that is exactly what AA did for me. It took me and made me better. For that, I am eternally grateful. Alright, thank you, folks. I'm your host, Jason, and until next time, 1AA time, 1AA place, and 1AA channel.